Okay, so I'm John Chandler. I'm a amateur researcher and a kind of retired HEMA guy living here in New Orleans, and I have the pleasure today to speak all the way in Lisbon. Is that where you're at, Lisbon?
Yeah.
To Filipe
Right.
Martins, who's another OG of HEMA and very interesting guy that I met at HEMAC Dijon, I think it was in 2019, right? And then subsequently we've shared a lot of our mutual interests in research online, and so I would like to take this opportunity to introduce Filipe to you, the elect few who watch my YouTube channel, and we're going to learn a little bit about what he does in the HEMA world and the research world, and who knows, we might even dip into model tanks at some point. So, all right, Filipe. Take off, take and run with that.
Well, hello, Jean. Thanks for having me. So my name is Filipe Martins. I'm from Lisbon. I'm 48 years old. I don't know if that interests, but who knows? So I've been. I'm a what they call a history buff. So I love history from I don't know from 4 or 5 years old, especially military history. And I started doing HEMA about I don't know 7, 8 years ago, something like that, maybe more. Um, it, it, it has been a very very fantastic experience, and I've learned a lot, not just about swords and weapons and stuff, but mostly about history, which is still my true passion.
Mm.
And
you
I don't know.
you've done another martial art for a while too, right? Hapkido, is that right? Did I get that
Yeah,
right?
I still do it actually. It's been I don't know 18, 19 years old, 19 years so far, so something like that. So it's also let's call it's my real martial art. Okay, fencing
Yeah,
is
so
one of the martial arts, but Hapkido it's the one
I was
I've
just
been.
talking with a young HEMA fencer today about this, what we bring to the table and when we go into HEMA. So can you talk a little bit about Hapkido and how that informed your understanding of and tell me which fencing masters and sources that you like to use, and how your background in the Hapkido informed that.
Sure. So thing is that when I came to Hema. Okay, yeah, I already knew a lot about Hapkido. Hapkido, for those who don't know, it's a mix. Actually, it's a mixed martial art. It comes from the origins are in Japan, actually. Although it's a Korean martial art, the origins are in Japan, with Daito Ryu Apki Jujutsu, and the Korean guy who learned it. When he came to Korea, he started developing it, and it also included some stuff from Taekwondo, like kicks and punches, and so it's a very it's a martial art that has a lot of techniques, not just throws and so on, but also punches and stuff like that. Anyway, the basics of our martial arts are always the same, like a good balance, good stance. And when I started practicing Hapkido, Hema, I noticed almost immediately that there's a lot of connections, because our body is always one for ages, So we can only do some stuff. Okay, we can only do some techniques because our body only allows for some techniques, and especially when I started to practice. Abrazare from Fiore and Ringen from Talhofer mostly, I came to realize that there were the same techniques. Like for instance, if I was in a class that we were doing Fiore, actually sometimes it was like, hey, I did this last night, no, last evening. We were doing the same, it's exactly the same. So my evolution in that terms was actually quite fast because I already knew what to do. Okay, and I was able to analyze properly what we were doing, sword related or spear related, whatever, by taking what I had learned, what I have brought from Hapkido into HEMA classes, and the opposite is also the same because
Mm.
when I started, going further into fencing, I started to realize. Ways to different approaches to my Hapkido practice, and in different ways to understand what I was doing and how did it work, why, and all those all that evolution. So it was not like taking something in like a Korean martial art and taking it to an European martial art. It worked both ways. So that was very
It gives
interesting.
the old literature gives you a framework to understand the movement and the nature of fighting and all that. I mean, in my early days in starting Lichtenauer, I was reading Book of Five Rings, by Musashi, and getting some of the advice there. Yeah, so specifically with as it relates to to grappling and so on, I think that's it's very helpful, and timing and tempo, because of course not everybody listening to this is going to know that, but in most of our 15th 16th century sources that we're referring to, usually when we say HEMA is a lot of times what we mean, although HEMA is broader subject than that. But in these earlier sources, there's a relatively little information about some of the very fundamental things, that the just basic movement and um, the concepts of tempo are there, but the way they talk about it is sort of assuming that you already know a bit about it. So it took us a while to get up to speed for that. And I think in the early days of HEMA, a lot of people were bringing what we sometimes call the frog DNA, whatever martial art they did before, and also the books that they've read and things like that. For us in my club, I was never a great grappler. I was afraid to destroy my knees because I was a big fat guy. But the grappling that I learned, which was mostly from Fiore initially, was because we had a guy in the club that did Japanese jiu-jitsu. And before I got him into the club, I showed him some Fiore. I showed him a book. I had a copy, and he said, "That's Japanese. They stole that. That's not. That's not." I said, "Yeah, but this is from Italy in 1405. This is it's another part of the war. Now, who knows? Maybe they got it from Japan. I mean, the Italians were going already to China in the 13th century, so who knows where the connections go? But he was drawn into it because of that. And then I learned my best number one grappling technique that I always like to use in tournaments and stuff, which was get into a bind. I push the elbow. That's the only thing. I don't even. Actually, a British guy in Germany, Colin Richards, told me a good bit of advice on that too, which was I had learned all these once we got the jiu-jitsu guy in our club. Learned a lot of this disarms, some from Lichtenauer tradition, some from the Italians, Fiore Vadi, the early stuff. And I wanted to do them, but I found, you get in a bind and then it's over. And damn it, I missed the chance. And this guy told me, he said, "Look, don't think about what you're going to do. You've already trained 16 of these things. You just reach out, and whatever you get, that's what you do. So if you touch the pommel, you do one thing. If you touch the wrist, it's another. You touch the face, it's another. You touch the elbow, it's another." And that helped. So I was actually it was my one reliable uh,
And
grappling
only,
technique.
and actually, you only need to know like like five techniques or something, because if you learn like 100 techniques, forget it. It won't work. Okay, in the heat of the motion of the moment, sorry, in the heat of the moment, you it's like you having those cards when you're playing. You'll just take off just one or two cards, and that's it. Okay, it's like
Yeah,
um,
I have the theory on that, though, which is I have to admit I just developed on my own. I don't know how well this ties in with the theory in the fight books, but I feel like when you're out at what the Germans would call the Zufechten and the onset distance, you're watching your opponent and you're starting to assess how they're fighting and where their strengths and weaknesses are. Here you can make plans out here, and then once you're in Krieg, There's
Do
no
it.
more
Do
plans.
something.
If you're waiting to
Yeah.
make a plan, if you're thinking about your options, you're done. And I do feel that this might be a primitive way to look at it, because I know that as I've seen people who really are taking things to another higher and higher level of this, when I was one of the guys that was doing HEMA in 2000, but we didn't know what we were doing. I mean, we were taking basically just guards and a few very simple, crude interpretations of devices and adding that to whatever kind of fighting we had already. And then gradually, I've seen there's different levels that people are reaching. There's 20% fight books. There's 40% fight books. You're starting to see a few people now, especially I think in Europe, where that you see some people that really not just for a moment when you're fighting, they're watching them fence, where here and there's a flash where it looks like something right out of the manual, but all the time they're starting to look that way. And I think maybe as we
Last year,
penetrate deeper into
last year, I was present actually. I was judging um, a tryout for the next IFEMA Cup. Okay, so we did the test trial last Dijon. This year will be the first new model IFEMA Cup. And the thing that we were striving to is to get not just hitting points, which is okay, but also quality technical points. Okay, so like for instance, you would get maximum of 5 hitting points. Okay, which is okay, but all the remaining points would be for technicality. Okay, no, good stance, good proper approach, good techniques, and so on. And I remember this guy. I mean, there were a lot of very good fencers. For instance, Diana Mates, for instance, excellent fencer, and some other guys. But I remember this one. I don't know if it was Polish or French, whatever. And I was looking at him, and I was like, whoa, this is amazing, beautiful fencing, right? Beautiful fencing. And it was all Fiore, and I think a little bit of Vabi as well. But you could see, like, if you were reading Fiore's book, okay, you could see all of it there. And the guy was really fighting. It was, I mean, of course, he won all his bouts, of course. Um, that was beautiful. That was like what you're saying,
yeah,
40%.
that's right. Right. I think we're seeing more and more. And I remember one of the first times for me was seeing actually on a video. I wasn't even in person, but I was watching one of the fights at Swordfish in 2010, and it was Christine Consumo fighting this huge guy who was was an experienced stick fighter but didn't know any HEMA. So it was a really interesting matchup of a slim, pretty tall, 5'9", 5'10" woman against a guy who's 6 feet 4 inches tall, who was not at all concerned about holding back. It was really aggressive, very, very aggressive guy. And I think she was a fairly new student to I-33, which is a sword and buckler manual, as you know. But for everyone else listening, it's possibly the earliest of the medieval traditions that we know of. The dating is still somewhat debated, and it's about fighting with a sword and a small shield called a buckler. And it depicts a woman fighting, which has always been an interesting aspect of it. And Christine had
Yes.
learned it, and she was fighting this guy, and she was doing it like it looks in the manual. So her posture, she's sort of up on her toes, and it was working. And she was covering her hands and protecting her hands with the hop shield guard and everything, which is kind of the key to that system, which is a very effective system, I think. And it was just this moment of absolute, her form was by no means perfect, but I saw flashes just here and there, like, oh, that's right out of the Walpurgis manuscript. And then increasingly, as time went on, I see more and more. And one of the aspects, I think, maybe we could talk about this, about the purpose of IFHEMA and kind of where that's going. Because I've learned that there's a lot of these other things from the Renaissance that are being rediscovered, and one of those is the mnemonic system, which we know is very closely tied in with a lot of the fight books. Fiore has his system with all the animals that represent the different traits of fencing and of different fencers, and it seems simple and it seems crude. It's based on Aristotelian physics, so it's based on the 4 elements of. Go ahead.
Don't call it crude.
No, no, no.
Not
You know, I'm saying, yeah, I'm saying initially it seems crude. Now I know better.
Let me explain. Even nowadays, 21st century. Okay. Okay. Yeah, you have the four types. Okay. The what they call sanguíneo,
Yes,
sanguine,
sanguine, choleric, melancholic,
and yeah,
and phlegmatic.
phlegmatic. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, you know that nowadays in the sports theory, no, modern sports theory, they also have four types
Right.
of sportsmen.
Yeah.
Exactly
Yeah.
the four types.
Look, I'm a convert. I want people to sort of take the journey that I took because this is a challenge too. Once you cross the threshold and you're in the medieval mindset, which I'm very much in now, uh, you have to remember how to get back to where everybody else was. And so initially, when you're first hearing about Aristotelian physics, and then there's the Galenic version, the medical Galenic version, which is what you're just now talking about, it sounds silly because we know everything's not just made out of a combination of air and earth or water and fire. But what you come to realize is that it is, as much as it is a physical theory and a physics theory that does get you to places of real outcomes, like with alchemy and so on. It is effectively a mnemonic system, I believe, to remember all the correlations between various things. So it makes the patterns of, in fencing, it's about people's personalities and approaching different fencing in different ways, approaching it spontaneously, approaching it aggressively, approaching it meticulously, approaching it calmly, and so forth. But it also translates in quite a bit of detail to very complex things that we also know have very real measurable outcomes. And one of those things is that the memory palace system, the method of Loki system, where you create a visual space in your mind, the palace or um, I when I was in my old job, I used to work in the maritime industry, and I had to deal with a lot of clients that were very, very demanding because the software had to do with sort of running ports all over the U.S. So I could get a call 3 o'clock in the morning and have to get into their system, and I had trouble remembering all the passwords, which were constantly changing. So I made myself a very simple memory palace of all these ships, one for each one of these clients, and then what's on the ship tells me what the password is because I was reading about it and I was interested in it. And then subsequently, I've learned that, I mean, A, it worked for me. And then B, mine was very crude. I mean, mine had like four things, and each palace, each ship had like four things. And one of them is always a joke because apparently jokes, they tell you this is a good way to remember things.
Good
But I've
word.
learned that there's a memory Olympics. There's people, I want to interview one of these people because there's people that are deep into the method of Loki, the memory palace, which, as we know, goes back to the classical world. Um, and I think that's applicable to HEMA as we get deeper into understanding the fight books. There are
Mhm.
these mnemonic cues all through the fight books on every system that I've really been able to somewhat deeply look at. And I'm not quite the expert as some of my friends, and probably even as you are on the books, but it's there. And maybe that is how to get where we go all the way back to. This is maybe how you remember more of your repertoire when you're fencing, or it
It
becomes more
depends.
available to you.
It depends. For instance, I know some guy. Well, one of them is João Oliveira. You fought with him
Yeah,
in
yeah, he
Dijon.
defeated me at Dijon. Yeah,
He defeated because you changed his system, and but exactly at the same time that you run out of steam.
yeah,
It happens.
yeah, yeah. Well, that's
But
what you got to do. You have to be able to change. That's a really important lesson. Yeah, yeah,
exactly. For instance, João has an extraordinary memory. Actually, I use him for, for remembering my things. Hey, João, when did I do that? When did I do that? Oh, you did it someday, or okay. So João has an extraordinary memory. So, for instance, he knows by heart some of Fiore stuff. Actually, most of it. Um, and I believe also that sort of mnemonic also helps him. Okay, but for instance, for other systems which I know of, for instance, Godinho, there, as far as I know, there's no mnemonics there, nothing. Okay, or for instance, the other systems that I've studied, Alfieri, François Dancy, and some other guys. I see no way of no that process of memorizing their system. There's only no postures, some simple things like nails down, nails up, and so on and so on. But there's no such process. I think that's a bit more medieval than, for instance, the Renaissance.
I
But
agree. No, I think you're right. I think you're right. I think there's a definitely there's a marked change, and it's not all at once, but we definitely see a shifting from the medieval mindset to the early modern or the Renaissance, which the latter is or I would say early modern mindset is the pedagogy of it. When you're reading something like a Joachim Meyer manual versus one of the earlier Lichtenauer manuals in the German context, the Meyer reads in a very modern way. It's not just poems and allusions and allegories. It is like picking up a manual for how to fix a car today or something, except that it's a very complicated manual. So it still has just as hard to learn. It's like I can have a very clear, lucid manual on how to run a nuclear reactor, but it's still going to take me some time to get my head around all that. And so Meyer gives you that challenge too. So I want to circle back to Godinho. So Godinho I know he's Iberian. Is he Portuguese or Spanish? He's Portuguese, right?
yeah. Godinho.
So at this phase of the history of fencing, so he is he's what, late 16th century, is that right, Coutinho?
Yeah. Godinho, actually, it comes from Santarém. Santarém is a city some 100 kilometers north of Lisbon. He wrote like a manual in late 16th century, so 1599. We know almost nothing about him. We know that because he tells us that he was a master of arms, Portuguese, like I said. He actually wrote in a broken Spanish. He wrote a manuscript. I suppose that one day perhaps you would like to publish it, but it never did. So it's like a very roughly written manuscript. Not very organized or something. Not at all, actually. A lot of notes also, with a sort of a start and then a new start at the end of the manuscript and so on. Very messy. We don't know. I studied this author along with my friend Luis França. Is the school author of this translation into Portuguese. So that's me. I think you
Okay,
can see
all right.
it.
Yeah, good props. Yeah, congratulations. Part of the effort, part of the great project.
Yeah, exactly. And okay, so we don't know where did he learn his fencing. It could have been in Portugal, could have been in Spain. We don't know. We're pretty sure that he didn't learn his fencing from Italy because there's no Italian words or something. Nothing of an Italian system in this book. It would have if he had learned from Italian fencers. But we do know that there's some similarities with other excerpts from Texas, from Spain. So maybe it belongs to a sort of a system or sort of old school, let's call it school, like a big system that was being used in Spain and Portugal at the same time. So like
that makes sense. I mean, a lot of first of all, we know in general that people moved around more than we used to think in all these periods. So they got around a lot, and of course the people that were skilled martial artists or that were warriors would often have kind of a roaming lifestyle and would move from place to place and fight for different masters or different mercenary companies or different princes or towns or whatever. I wanted to mention that for Godinho, I met this kid, James Clark, at an event in the East Coast. I think it was in Boston. And he was a kid that he got a nickname that I think he got annoyed at, but he was sort of named after his interest in the montante. And he he was friends with some of the guys in DC. I think Steve Hick and some of those guys that were trying to do early translations of Godinho. And I had one of these moments that you get at a good HEMA event where you go off to the side with somebody and then they're telling you, they're sharing with their enthusiasm for something. And this kid was, first of all, he could do, he could do the plays. He could do the Montante plays, which is impressive to see because I'd never seen it before. It was I'd seen sort of Matt Gallus's version, but not all of the whole, the whole thing. And his
I could
enthusiasm
just
was, yeah, go
I
ahead.
think I think Steve Hicks didn't translate Godinho, but Figueiredo. I think it was Figueiredo.
Well,
But anyway,
somebody in that
yeah,
DC area had translated some of Godinho because it was Godinho. I had seen some of the Figueroa stuff before, and this, James was explaining the context of it a lot to me. It was all basic stuff, but the idea of the destreza commune and the destreza especial, and the
yeah,
role, the idea that what I was super excited by, because this wasn't in any of the manuals that I'd already seen, was that it included scenarios that were like real life, something that the badass bodyguard guy is going to run into, like how to fight on a gangplank and how to fight in the plaza and how to protect the VIP. And I've now seen,
yeah,
people demonstrating this.
like guarda de dama. So you're guarding a lady, or for
Yeah.
instance, this one guarding the cloak and the fazenda. Fazenda, that's like stuff, you know.
So
Or
that's where you
for
put the
instance,
cloak on the ground and then you're marking down your spot.
exactly 4 streets, so it's a crossroad.
Yeah,
Okay,
right, right,
and
right. I remember there's one
or
in the alley where you put your back on one wall, and then you go to your back on the other wall. And so for context, we're talking here, these manuals, most of these Iberian manuals are predominantly emphasizing the rapier or the espada ropera, right? Like they're mostly about the thrusting sword.
okay, so you have to realize one thing. Except for Godinho, there are no other old fencing manuals in. Oh, yeah, and sorry, and perhaps Pedro Monte. Pedro Monte, if we consider that he was Spanish, but
Right, we
some
don't
people
know. We
say
don't know for sure. He shows up in Italy. We think he's Spanish. He's another one that really, really gets into the four humors thing too, right?
exactly. But let's forget about Pedro Monte for now. So there are no other surviving fencing manuals of the old style. So destreza comum, as we call it, or as Pacheco or Carranza, whatever some of them call it, destreza comum. Nothing at all. So we have no Francisco Roman, Pedro, Jaime Pons, none of those. And
They
there
all focus. They all
we
focus on the special fencing, right?
yes, they call it destreza verdadeira. So true fencing, true art.
Okay, so let me
Okay.
try to contextualize this real quick. So, just for anybody that's listening, so the idea, and this was also very exciting because this is a theory we have had about some of the Lichtenauer fencing, which is still debated and it's not settled, I think. But the idea is that there's two systems. There's a system of fencing that everybody does, or that a lot of people do. That's the well-known system of fencing. That's a little simpler, and then there's another system that is more sophisticated, and that's more sort of in the case of Iberian manuals, I think it's maybe a little more geometry based. That is designed to defeat the common fencing system, and we actually have hints of this perhaps in some of the German manuals and also in some of the accounts of German fencing masters. The idea of the master strikes and the hidden strikes, where you see that there's some people getting in a fight and the bystanders say, "Wow, I don't know what happened. He just like threw the sword out, and all of a sudden the other guy was wounded and he wasn't touched, and we couldn't tell what was going on." Which, whether that's real or not, I know it's very debated, but we see there definitely is two systems in the Iberian world, right?
Okay. Let me see. Actually, there's an article, a very good article by Alberto Bompresi. He talks about that. But the thing was this: we have to understand that in the 16th century there was a military and a mental revolution at the same time. Okay, namely at the military, but also in the arts. That's mind that. So in the 15th century, we start to have things like geometry and perspective in the arts. Okay, and that that goes into the military arts as well. So in the construction of fortresses and so on, and also it goes into the concept of the battle formations. Okay, so when you have pike squares and you see the pike squares and all, then you see the columns of arquebusiers and musketeers. Okay, in the corners. Okay, that is in fact like a fortress.
Oh yeah,
And
yeah, like
it's thought
bastions.
the bastions exactly. So all that geometry and mathematics that was implicit, it was needed in order to make those formations, in order to administrate the military. Eventually, it was transported into fencing. Okay, the guys for instance Gisliero, even Agrippa was an engineer, as you know, and he wrote a treatise on military art. Most people in IMA don't know that, but they should. Or for instance Carranza or Pacheco, those guys, they were actually professional soldiers, except for Agrippa. Agrippa was an engineer. So their vision of the battlefield was geometric, was based on geometry. Okay, it was transported into their understanding of fencing. Okay, let's do it according to geometrical and mathematical principles. And as you know, maths don't lie. Okay, 1 + 1 is 2. Period. Okay, they don't lie. So if you apply a correct geometry into fencing, it will always work. At least that's, well, their idea, which is
Yeah.
not a bad idea because it really works.
Okay, so
Although,
let me say let me make one comment that will reinforce what you just said, and then another one that I'm going to bring you into my wingnut theory that challenges it, and that also explores this link between the medieval mindset and the early modern. So when I did a few years ago, I did an article for the ACTA that was an analysis of two memoirs. One of them was the famous Italian sculptor Benvenuto Cellini, who was also a little bit of maybe a serial killer. He got a lot of fights. And then there was another guy who was a German burgomeister named Bartholomeus Sastrow, and it was kind of a contrast. But it was like looking at their life experiences and the fights they got into or saw, and then how that related back to the fencing manuals. And one of the Sastrow, by the way, at one point when he was traveling, he disguised himself as Portuguese because he'd been to Portugal. And this is one of the interesting things about a medieval world. This is early 16th century, but people that travel, they knew the ways of other parts of the world. You know, he's like, oh, I put my dagger over here and I throw my cloak over this shoulder instead of that shoulder. And now everybody thinks I'm Portuguese. And because he had to travel through the Protestant area or the Catholic areas to get back to his Protestant home. But Cellini, several times he was an artist, and he was trained as an artist in the medieval way as a craft. And one of the things that artists learned by going through their apprentice journeyman system was they were taught Euclid for pure geometry and Vitruvius for geometry as it relates to the human world. And so whenever he was in a town that thought they might be about to go to war, the town leadership or the prince, it was once in Milan, I think, and once in Florence, but either way, both cases, they said, go get all the real artists. And then they took them out to the defenses and they said, okay, you need to redesign the defenses because now the cannons are 20% stronger and the arquebuses have 30% more range. And he almost got in a sword fight with with one of the condottieri that was out there because they were disagreeing. He came up with some radical idea on redoing the bastion, and the guy was disagreeing with him, and said, "Wait a minute!" And just the way he described in his own memoir the way this guy was, even though Cellini was a straight up killer, they stopped the fight, and I think he was lucky they stopped the fight because that guy, the way he described this dude, like he sounded like he was ready to get him. All right, but let me plunge into my radical alternative approach, which is that the medieval system, which looks at the same kind of data in a different way, I think it's a myth really that they didn't know about the geometry and all that. They just looked at it in a different angle because they were all studying the classical sources and the medieval periods in its different, you going in back to the Carolingian period, they're just trying to find some classical sources and get back to the basics. Then you get to the high medieval period with Thomas Aquinas and Albertus Magnus, and they're quantifying and integrating the classical auctores as they knew them into Christian theology of their time. And then by the time you get to the late medieval period, they're starting to surpass the ancients. The ancients are reading manuals from the ancients, and one of the linchpins is the publication of the Bella Fortis manual, where he's looking at all the fighting of his own day. And I just recently learned, by the way, from my good friend Jörg Gassman, who just translated a 13th century Italian war manual, that this split from Vitigius, these Roman experts that they were copying a lot, and where you can see Bella Fortis really diverges a lot, because they're like, hey, we got guns. Now, the Romans don't know what a gun is. We're going to go off on our own now. But this was already happening in the 13th century. I can now see it was a gradual process. A lot of times, it's not as abrupt as we think. But so when it comes to the sort of scientific pike and shot era world of the armies moving around in their squares and all that, the origin of that is actually, interestingly, very similar and kind of linked, I think. This is my wingnut theory. So it comes from Switzerland, as you probably know, ultimately. The Swiss developed a system of reviving the pike. The pike as a super long spear, very, very, very long spear, 15 to 20 feet long. 18 feet ends up being so I don't know, what is that, 6 meters something. So very, very long. So this had been used for a long time on and off to fend off cavalry. But the Swiss realized that if you get a bunch of guys and you get them used to moving around with these 18-foot-long spears, they can move into another infantry formation and wipe them out. And you use the big spear as long as the formation holds together. When the formation breaks up, you draw the sword. And a lot of these Swiss guys are carrying, as you can see in their chronicles, they're carrying long swords, big long swords, right? Which is, why would you carry that all around with you when you probably aren't even going to use it? Well, I think it's because a lot of these guys were trained. A lot of them were burghers. The center of the Swiss army, people think of it as the wild mountain people, but the epicenter of the Swiss, it was Bern and Zurich. So in their system, they used the something called the Vorhut, the Nachhut, and I think it's called I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but it's like the Gewaltehut. So one of them means the first column, or the first. They use this term heap, Haufen, which means like a gang or just a blob of men, but really it was a pretty well organized group. The first one is designed to make contact with the enemy and pin them. The vanguard. And then the second one is the big strong group that comes in, and so the first one is supposed to shock them and throw them off their balance and really do some damage, but it's not being designed to be able to really fight for long. So these are the fast-moving guys that are heavily armed, have a lot of energy, and if we're following Pietromonte, we probably have a certain Galenic personality type, right? These are the guys that are the cholerics, the guys that are really, but maybe not the stoic ones. Then the next group comes. That's a much bigger group, and
probably younger guys.
Exactly. You start with the younger guys, then you have the little bit more mature guys, and then you've got the Nachhut, which is either to make the flanking attack or to cover the retreat. And right, that's the reserve group, which they often would deploy fairly quickly. Now, the thing about the Swiss, when you get into these online in the military history circles, I know you know this. There's a lot of nationalism, So the British guys will come and say, I declare that longbows defeated everything in the Middle Ages. They could shoot right through castle walls, and there's sort of like all these debates, and the people, no, yeah, pro longbow, anti longbow. And whenever the Swiss were fighting some of their opponents, they had these opponents like Charles the Bold of Burgundy had a picked army with all the best fighters from all over Europe, and the Swiss annihilated them 3 times in a row. And every time they say, "Whoa, they got lucky." It was they were lining up for pay, they were lining up for chow. It was raining, they weren't expecting. Well, that's built into the Swiss.
Times they were lucky, lots of times, too many times.
They were lucky, but it was also the nature of their system. Their system was designed like in addition to the 3 main columns, which sounds a lot like Vor, Nach, and Indes in the fencing, right? But these are the principal concepts in the Leitner fencing system. It's an interesting coincidence, or is it? But they also had the forlorn hopes, which is another concept in military history I think is generally misunderstood. The idea of the forlorn hope. This is a small group that the sort of cliche version is that they're the suicide squad. They go out there, they're not big enough group to go tangle with 3,000 pikemen. They're just a couple hundred guys. Maybe they're gunners. Some of them are gunners. Some of them are halberdiers and so on. And you'll see in the Swiss Chronicles they have little flags. They've got either like a crossbow flag or like a crossed axe flag. And those guys were way out ahead, and they would find the enemy and then start causing problems. And so it's like a corpuscle. Like first one of them hits, next one hits, next one. So I think that, and then here comes the Vorhut right out of the woods, right when they're like, oh, there's a few Swiss skirmishers. Well, that's a problem.
Napoleonic tactics. Those would be the voltigeurs or the caçadores or the 95th Rifles.
Right.
Those guys. So they would harass the enemy, harass. They would pin them,
right.
And okay, we're pinned. Where's the vanguard? It's here. Okay,
right, because they're like, oh, they think it's always a worse problem than you thought it was. It's like, oh, I have a little problem with some skirmishers. Okay, well, we'll move some things. Oh, I can't move those guys. I can't. These guys can't cross this part because they're getting shot at. Oh, okay, we'll try something else. And then here comes the vanguard, and then here comes the big column. And then next thing you know, Charles the Bold loses Golden Bathtub and all his cannons, and so this system goes. What's that?
And eventually his own life. So
right, the first time they lose all the pointy shoes. Ever been to Grandson Castle? They have all the fancy the pointy shoes from the. Anyway, I have to. We should do just a purely military history chat one day. But so that this Swiss system defeats the Germans too, and Maximilian wants to copy it, and so he hires a bunch of Swiss to teach, and they make a system for teaching peasants. This is where it gets really different and interesting, because the princes, they know these guys from the Swiss Confederation, the leading part of their army were these two towns, Zurich and Bern, which are not, by the way, in the mountains. You can see the mountains, but they're like 500 meters above sea level. They're not. These are urban militias, is what it really is. But the problem for a prince like the Habsburgs, if they hire an urban militia to do fighting for them, which they did a lot in places like what's now Belgium, then those people want things. They want special rights. They want a lot of money. They don't want to fight for too long. They may not even want the prince to win. They want the prince to win enough, keep the British from coming in and taking over or something, keep the French out. But they don't want the prince to win every battle, because then he might start bossing them around too much. So what they really want is an army they can control more. So they get poor peasants, originally from Swabia, the Black Forest. They train them in this Swiss system, which the Swiss foolishly showed them how to do. And then they create the Landsknechten, the German mercenaries. And then, of course, the Habsburg family marries into the royal family in Spain. And then that system is recreated in Spain. And then you get the tercios and the Spanish version of it. And this coincides with all the changes in the pedagogy and how we transmit knowledge. Anyway, that's my wingnut theory.
I don't know if the Spanish tercios were modeled after the Landsknechten, or if they were modeled after already existing system that they had in Spain. Okay, with we would call it in Portugal companhias de ordnance companies. I think they would call it like Santa Hermandad or something. I'm not an expert in Spanish history, but they already had these companies. Like urban militias, but the thing is that here in the Iberian Peninsula, the connection between the urban militias and the king was very strong. Okay, because usually they would unite against nobles. They were very keen to fight noble influence. So they were like chartered by the very king. Okay, the king.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So yeah, they started to create those militias. They had guys with swords, sword and shield, and
Rodoleros.
Yeah, sort of, and guys with guns and crossbows, and of course spears, long spears. Okay, increasingly long spears. And so I think those were the guys who went to southern Italy with Gonzalo de Córdoba, the Gran Capitan, El Gran Capitan, and yeah, eventually, of course, they probably evolved into something better, perhaps influenced by the Swiss or Lansknechten.
My understanding is that they did go in and sort of the system, and it was really the part where they're like recruiting these really poor people from Extremadura, who are kind of almost at the serf level, like they're below even like a proper peasant level where the guy has land and can, because those people are difficult. Anybody that has rights, anybody that has some property is going to not 100% align with the agenda of the prince. The curious thing about this Landsknecht is that when the Swiss were working for Maximilian, he was asking him, how do I turn just a dumbass backward peasant from Black Forest? No offense to people in the Black Forest, obviously. We're not, peasants today necessarily, but how do I take these guys and teach them how to be expert fighters? And one of the things the Swiss said is that, look, you're going to have to give them some rights, some special rights. So let them, they don't all have to be political, right? Let them wear whatever they want. Let them elect some of their own leaders and so on. That's why Landsknecht and wear these really ridiculously, exuberant colors and all these weird patterns and everything, and it's just over the top because they had the right. That was one of their rights, and this helps build in the esprit de corps and all that. And it's a little bit different balance in the Iberian Peninsula, but these soldiers that are being recruited from these very poor areas definitely rise in status, and a soldier has a certain level of status, and as over time that starts to increase because as the gold starts coming in from the New World and everything, and from the Pacific, the princes are getting more powerful. The towns are getting weaker because they have to compete with that, and that was the case everywhere. Even in Germany, where they still had free cities for centuries, they were not as powerful as they had been in the Middle Ages, in the medieval period. So they once Charles V is coming back with his armies that are full of he's got all the gold, all the silver from the Incas, and anyway, there's clearly some Swiss DNA that comes into Spain, I think, and we can debate that later. But I'll send you some articles. But the idea is that the Swiss system, which is this medieval system, and it's like the medieval fencing where it's Vornach and Indes and all that, and it's all about timing and tempo on that basis, with the emphasis on they're looking at the same kind of structure, but they're placing their emphasis in a different way. They're transmitting the knowledge in a different way with a lot of poetry and analogy that people are picking up on through intuition and through their training that they would get from whatever estates they were coming out of. And then later, you get this transformation. Remember, Jeff Lord did a really interesting presentation on Meyer, and he was talking about that at the time the first Meyer fight books were being produced, where it was a revolution going on in the production of manuals for everything. And he was talking about an astronomy manual where they would go through this logical process of saying, okay, the sky is when you look up is that way, and the ground, this is the firmament is down here, and the air above you has no mass, and or at least it doesn't resist you, and so on. And then they're talking about what stars are and everything, and so it goes from a very, very basic level and then takes you all the way to the conclusion, which is very systematic, and as you say, it's precision, it's mathematics, it can't lie, but it is also arguably a little more rigid than the medieval system, where they're saying these are the principles. There's Vornach and Indes, there's Stern and Stirk, there's weak and strong, and pushing and and yielding, and these work this way. So it's like more, in a way, it's maybe a more dynamic system that can be rearranged and readapted to a lot of things.
Or maybe okay, yeah, there was this revolution in terms of scientific approach, something, okay.
It's something we recognize from the modern world. We could look at something from 1540 or 1560 and see it. That makes sense to us, right?
Who was the target public for those books? That's also important. For instance, when Fiore writes his manuals, or his manual that was copied, who knows? We know that he was writing for certain individuals, nobles, probably nobles who had been taught by him. So
I definitely agree.
Yeah, if you were my student, I don't need to tell you, okay, this is a sword. The sword has a quillion and has a pommel, and so yeah, come on, you already know that. Okay, so I don't need to teach you the basics. Moreover, if I write a book in which I I teach all the basics. If that book is read by someone who's not intended to, okay, that person will learn a lot, and I don't want that person to learn a lot. So I will be a bit more hermetic. And if you know what I'm talking about, you just read it. Oh yeah, of course, that's it. But
Let he
if you
who
don't
has
know
the
what
eyes to see, yeah, exactly, yeah.
the hell is this sword? What is a sword? I don't know what a sword is. Like that, and perhaps in 16th century, okay, we start to have printed books, lots of printed books, and so the target is much wider. So it's for initiated and non-initiated. So yeah, I suppose that most people who would buy a fencing book, they already had some experience. Okay, let's suppose, because everybody sort of would have a weapon, a sword in this case. But yeah, not everybody, but lots of people would have a weapon, especially those who could afford to buy a fencing book. But so in any way, the target public would be wider. So you wouldn't be as much as hermetic as you would be like in 15th or 14th century, I guess.
Yeah, so okay, just in support of what you just said, I think you do see in a lot of manuals, a lot of the medieval manuals, that they are talking about, I wrote it this way so that any fool won't be able to blunder into this and so on. And I also would say structurally, it's an interesting correlation what we're just talking about in terms of sort of the zero to hero progression in military training, where you're taking a peasant from Swabia or a peasant from Extremadura and taking them to a level of fairly high. You talk about the tercios. I mean, these are very, very effective military units that I would actually contrast if you look at the 30 Years' War, the deep into the pike and shot era in the 17th century. A pike square or a little infantry unit, a little block of musketeers or something, are not expected to be able to do as much as what the tercios could do, or as what the Swiss could do, or the Landsknechts. They in the 30 Years' War, a lot of times the pike square goes and parks itself next to the cannons or next to the banner, and it's there to fend off the cavalry if they come. The Swiss will go across the open field and fend off cavalry charges and restructure their formations, and they're a lot more capable. I think the tercios arguably as well. It's like, okay, I gave you the manual for exactly how to do this thing in detail, and we went from zero to hero level of sophistication on this, but I give you the engine, and then so that you can recreate it the other way, like Benvenuto Cellini when they're taking him to look at the fortifications outside of Milan, and he says, okay, we need to change the angles on some of these bastions because he knows the Vitruvius and the Euclid. I would also say that there is a kind of a myth about the medieval world that it was all about secrecy and like the sort of hermetic secrets of the guilds and the crafts, because that's where a lot of the militias come from. It's right out of the crafts. And there's another problem in the U.S. They call any organization of a craft of let's say of cobblers or cutlers, they call that a guild. In Europe, you would differentiate between it's a craft organization, and then the guild is sort of the social and political part of it, which can sometimes be a different structure because it's different groups together and all that. We have that here because we have the carnival societies here in New Orleans that work exactly the
Okay.
same way. But in a lot of the U.S., I think they don't understand it. And then the American scholars also call guilds corporations, which I think is ridiculous. They use the term corporate structure, and they mean something. They mean it in a broader way. But okay, throwing that out for a second, there's a lot of myths about crafts and guilds.
We have in Portugal corporações, which are the guilds, as far as I know, corporações, corporate, and also the
Okay.
Irmandades. Those would be like social groups within the corporations, the guilds, that take care of the sick and the elderly and the
Right, right.
widows and so
In New
different.
Orleans, we call those social aid and pleasure clubs, but they're also known as generally as confraternities. The church calls them.
Also,
The Catholic Church calls them sodalities. Another word.
That would be the correct name in Portuguese, of course. So
Say it
yeah, we
again.
had
What's the word again?
confraria. Confraria.
Okay, yeah, so a confraternity. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me throw something at you here that's kind of interesting. So Charles IV, who was one of the power, there every few generations you get a really powerful Holy Roman Emperor. Most of the Holy Roman Emperors are not all that powerful, but Charles IV was one of the really powerful ones, and he passed some laws that were against what he called conjurations, conspiracies, and confederations. Now, the term conjuration meant when you get all the jurors, all the peers of the group, and they make an oath. I, Jean, will support Philippe in all his research endeavors from now on, and then if the widows and orphans will be protected by the common fund and all that. That was how these guilds were created, and already the nobles were feeling threatened by that, and so he passed this law that was trying to ban, and this was in the 14th century. Obviously, it didn't work, and he made all these. Part of the reason why it didn't work is because he made a bunch of exceptions for towns that he had relationships with, like Prague and Nuremberg and stuff.
Oh yeah.
But I think there's a myth about how secretive the guilds were, because the guilds used this weird way of discussing things. It was sort of by allegory and by euphemism and by symbolism and some of these mnemonic concepts and everything. But they shared all that knowledge. That knowledge went around when they went on their journeyman trips all around Europe, and this is how the printing press went so quickly. It was the first one is in 1449, and then within 10 years you've got 20 of them, and within 30 years there's a 500. I mean, you've seen the numbers of incunabula, as they call them.
Uh-huh.
So I think that this was really more that it was the adaptation of some classical knowledge with some of this more mysterious barbarian knowledge that we all of our societies have, right?
Maybe it was not mysterious in the sense that just for some, but maybe it was their way of thinking, their way of
Right. That's what I'm saying.
yeah, of giving you the ideas. Okay, so that their way of talking. Let's put it this way. They talk
Yes.
by
It was their
by
way of
symbol.
thinking about how these things work, and it had some limitations,
You just
obviously.
enter a medieval church, for instance. You enter a medieval church, and if you look at it, and nowadays we don't see the painted walls because all of them had painted walls. Okay, and there's a lot of symbolism over there, and they knew it. They could see, for instance, if you see a pomegranate or a rose or whatever. Okay, they knew what that symbolized. We don't.
I'm starting to recognize all those things, and like this is very true in medieval art. Like one of the my Baltic book that I sent you, that in the cover it's a triptych from Hans Memling, and there's all these hilarious, very amusing layers of detail on that. So it's a depiction of the Last Judgment Day. So you got a bunch of people getting thrown in hell and they're burning on one side, and then a bunch of people being weighed, judged worthy and on their way to paradise on the other. So Memling was sort of a drunk. He was a German guy who was a heavy drinker in Bruges, and he was getting in trouble a lot. And he personally had disputes with a lot of Dominicans. And if you look at the people burning in hell, almost all of them have tonsures. They're these Dominicans, and he knew that he painted their faces. He knew what they looked like, and he knew he shows them burning in the fire. But he also has a couple of his friends in there as a joke, his artist friends that he liked, burning in hell because they knew they were bad, and then the guy sitting being judged worthy by the angel, who's going to heaven is Thomas Portinari, who was the Medici agent for Bruges that bought the painting. And I remember when I went to Siena, walking into the beautiful, breathtaking Siena Cathedral. One of the first things you see on the ground is there's a relief on the ground of a alliance of like 8 cities, and it's all the coats of arms of the cities, including the elephant one. I don't know if that's Rome or whichever one it was, but I reckon look, that's from Fiore. And then they've got speaking of Hermetic, they've got Hermes Trismegistus on the wall in there.
What?
Hermes thrice blessed. The Hermes from the Hermetic tradition, the Hermes, the kind of fusion of Hermes and Thoth. You don't know who I'm talking about?
No.
Okay, so you understand the idea of the Hermetic tradition. This comes from Alexandria in Egypt, where it's a sort of mixture of Greek and Egyptian philosophy. And this idea, there was apparently there was a guy that called himself Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes thrice blessed, and this is a central figure in modern esoteric. It's these people like the Ordo Templar Orientalis and
Rosicrucian. Oh yeah.
Aleister Crowley, those guys. But in the Renaissance and in the late medieval period, a lot of people were studying this because all this stuff was tied in with the technology. So if you're trying to learn better techniques for smelting metals or making chemistry, making better gunpowder or something like the 3227A manual, as you're familiar with. Fencing, very interesting because it's kind of notes. It's not really written for a prince. It's probably for the guy's own use. But then it also has alchemy. It's got the Liber Ignium. It's got magic spells and stuff in it too. And so these things. Bellafortis as well has sorcery. There's a necromancy to summon a couple of goblins to go break into a castle and open the gate for you.
Exactly. Talhofer has that.
Right.
Fencing, the
Yeah.
Bellafortis, and some alchemy and Jewish stuff and
Right. Yeah. Geomancy and onomancy and all this.
I know all of this. All of this. I'm Talhofer, and this is my book of knowledge.
Yeah, and one of those books, when I first read about it, it was a pyrotechnic book that's in the 3227A called the Liber Ignium. When I first read about that, I thought, it's medieval pyrotechnic chemistry. How sophisticated? Well, apparently it was very sophisticated, and one of the things that's in it is instructions on how to process salt of St. Peter so that you end up with proper potassium nitrate and not calcium nitrate. Because if you have calcium nitrate in your gunpowder, if it gets any moisture or humidity in it, it won't work. So that was a pretty important thing to figure out. And that's probably there's a bunch of other stuff in there. There's a bunch of other pyrotechnic weapons, compounds, and treatments for burns, all kinds of ways to deal with burns, like with aloe and stuff, which does, by the way, work. And so is that as usual, when I first discovered medieval things, I'm thinking, it's the Middle Ages. These people, they're backward, But they weren't backward. So I think the medieval pedagogical approach to these things is
they were not stupid. They were not stupid.
Right. We've all learned that, right? Yeah.
A lot of people, of course, you and I, people around us, they know that. But a lot of people, most people think that, medieval, they were British, they were stupid, and so on.
Right. Nasty, British, and short is the way the life is supposed to be.
And
there's reasons for that.
Than we think. They knew a lot more than we think. Yeah.
Yes, obviously. Okay, so I know we've already been talking for a while, so I want to circle back. This ties in with something else I want to talk about, which is IFHIMA, and you have chastised me a couple of times for not knowing Portuguese yet. One of the things I'm struck by, and I do want to learn Portuguese, and I have a research project in mind I've told you about for the early 16th century Portuguese explorers, and there's some really good sources for that. But one of the things that I'm struck by reading about medieval universities is how good they were at teaching. You send some kid, he goes there when he's 13 years old, he goes to Bologna or Krakow or Oxford or something, and then he's there for 3 years, which seems to be an endless series of being arrested at whorehouses and being in fights, duels, and gambling, and somehow he comes out of there and he can design a cathedral. He's an astronomer and he can heal people. Look at Copernicus. He was a lawyer and a doctor, and he did astronomy on the side. So how many languages do you speak, first of all, and then what's your recommended approach to learning both ancient and modern languages? And then talk a little bit about IFHIMA. That's a big range.
I'm a pretty good Portuguese speaker.
Mm-hmm.
Believe me.
That's the most important thing. Yeah.
Yeah. I know some English. I know some French. I know some Spanish, but Spanish doesn't count because I'm Portuguese. So it's like.
Oh, it counts.
Yeah.
Mexico's not far from the U.S., and a lot of people in the U.S. don't speak Spanish. So.
Yeah, but it's not the same language. And I can speak, understand some Italian. Russian because I learned Russian. Not for long, but I did it.
So your English is excellent. And French, Spanish. That's 4 solid, and then pretty good Italian too, and some Russian. So yeah,
Well,
you
actually, a few years ago, when I went to visit Roberto Gotti's school and museum, which I strongly recommend, but I mean strongly recommend, not just because of the weapons, but also because of the books. Like he has a huge stash.
Yeah, let's come back to that. I want you to explain what that
No,
is and talk about it.
and I actually gave a, believe me or not, a continuing class in a very broken Italian, but I did manage. So
Nice, nicely done.
it was fun. Although I think people will just probably they will look at me like, "Whoa, what the hell is this guy doing?" I did it anyway. But the thing is, those guys in those days, they were a bit polymaths. So they didn't just stick to, okay, I'll be the best guy in the world doing this small thing. I know a lot about this
Right,
small
right.
thing. No, it didn't work that way. They tried to know this and this and this and this, all of that. And so they would be yeah, fencers and artisans and perhaps physicians and so on and so forth and so forth. For instance,
Everybody knew some law. Everybody had to be at least a little bit of a lawyer, right?
yeah,
You
yeah,
know.
yeah. If you know how to write and read, yeah, blood laws, that would be a nice way to go because you would earn a lot of money. And of course, you could also be a like a redactor, writing for someone else. I don't know how do you call that?
Like a scribe
Uh,
or a ghostwriter.
you could be also a scribe. That would earn you a bit more money and so on. For instance, a couple of days ago, I was searching for a bibliographical reference for the guy, and then I came up with this article written in the 60s actually, but still up to date, about people who were examined as physicians in Portugal in the late 15th century. And and there was this list with lots of names. Of course, 80% were Jewish, as expected, because they were the greatest physicians in those days.
And highly
And
educated at all times, then and now.
yeah,
Usually is a big part of the culture, right?
and so on and so on and so on. And actually, I was surprised by this. There was this guy was Jewish, was examined as a physician, and he was also an armorer. That was a surprise for me.
What town was he in, or where was he? Did
I
it
don't,
say where he
I
was
don't
from?
remember. I don't remember, but I took I record the document so I can send it to you.
Oh yeah, I'd love to see that. I'm very interested in that. I've been kind of keeping track. I've been trying to figure out because you do see some, like you see some Jewish fencers, you see some Jewish occasionally like mercenaries and so on, and I'm interested in figuring out how they connect in these various places. You know.
thing. So this Jewish physician was also an armorer. So I figured that
Yeah. So
his great job was being an armorer, and he was also a physician, just like fencers. Okay, most fencers masters, masters, sorry, were actually they had their day jobs.
right,
Okay,
right. Yeah,
like
they did the fencing kind of for fun, right? It's part of like a side thing, you know, like we do, like we do.
or something like that. So that's interesting. That's why sometimes we cannot actually find fencing masters in our records, or at least, well, I tried to search for it. I didn't
Because
manage to find
they had multiple hats. They weren't always a fencing
it.
master.
Yeah, so some guy who's doing like is a shopkeeper and so on. Yeah, he's also a fencing master, but that's not mentioned. So he's someone died. He was a shopkeeper. Okay,
Right,
probably
right.
you fencing master. So um, that's it. Nowadays we tend to perhaps to become specialists in just one thing. Okay, like yeah, I'm a lawyer or
Or you
something
could be
like.
like a physicist where you know a lot about deep, you know, sidereal physics and astrophysics and things. But then you meet somebody like that, and then they're some of them are polymaths, and they do know a lot. But there's a lot of people that are so specialized now, and we see that among historians too, academic historians that walk around. They're expert on a particular time and place, but they don't know things like that. We were talking about, before the interview, we were talking about how like there's these cliches like armor doesn't work in movies. And that's where they get a lot of their ideas about, swords weigh 15 pounds, they can cut through armor, no. You should know that because you're a historian. I've met academics like that are in the history field, and they don't know these basic things because they're so specialized. And that is a bit of a problem, I think, today.
I'm an expert in the Portuguese weavers from 1820 to 1830. Yeah, well, that's great, but how about
Right.
all the rest? Well, I don't know.
Yeah,
Well,
right. I mean, that's definitely an issue. I wanted to mention too, this is an aside, that I read a law in Mainz in Germany that said that the physicians were required under pain of a 3 gulden fine that if they were before they operated on anyone or supervised a surgeon, which is a lower order of medical person to operate, they had to cast a horoscope of the person, which required those days the horoscope. It's not like 1-900 telephone psychic. It's a lot of math. I've got a couple of these old medieval grimoires, and don't worry, I won't summon any demons because the math is too hard. It's way, way, way too much math. You had to know. Another one is I got a book that somebody did a project where they translated this book written by a Venetian sailor who was originally from Rhodes, and he was an admiral in the Venetian army. He started off as a rower in a galley, and then worked his way up and became an admiral. And he wrote a book that was all about fighting on ships and designing ships. He has a bunch of ship designs, and then navigating and so on. And at the time, they were using a lot of trigonometry for navigation because, of course, they knew that, unlike some people today, they knew the Earth is a sphere and that you can't just draw a straight line across a map and get where you want to go because it curves. So, and I was looking at the trigonometry in that, because it's a modern translation, so they translate the math in a format that you can. And man, I went to New Orleans public school, and my math is not good enough. I don't think I can get very high in the Venetian Navy. Like not only could I not have the endurance to row for 17 days, but anyway. So yeah, I think we can see that, and I think that ties in with.
Again back to the tercios and the sergeant major nowadays in the army. Sergeant major is a NCO, no, the
Right.
highest NCO, but yeah, it's still an NCO. Back then, sergeant major was the equivalent to today's major, and he was the real expert in military affairs. He was the professional guy, not the master of the camp, which is the regimental commander or something, the tercio commander. That would be an appointed nobleman, for instance.
Right, the prince's nephew, the duke's
Yeah,
nephew.
exactly. Stuff like that. But no, he was a professional, and they had to know their maths, and they really knew their maths. And if you were an artillery captain or something, yeah, you really had to be an expert in maths. Really good.
That's another interesting thing in like the German armies. The guy that was in charge of their artillery all the way through the medieval, but also well into the 16th century, where a lot of times the Germans called them the Büchenmeister. This was the guy that cast the cannons, because you really got to know your stuff. You got to know how much powder can you put in that thing. How much is it going to take before it blows up in your face, kills everybody. And the story of this guy that ended up making the giant cannons for the Turks.
Orban, Urban, yeah, Orban.
Yeah, Orban, just kind of like the current leader of Hungary's name. He wanted to make giant cannons. He just wanted to make giant cannons, and none of the European princes were like, "What do you mean? Wait, how big? You want to make a that shoots balls that are a meter wide? I don't need a cannon. Like, how am I going to move a cannon like that?" So he goes to the Ottomans, and they're like, "Yeah, we could do that.
Okay, yeah.
Let's do it." And they let him make the cannons, and he started this cannon workshop that created the Dardanelle gun. He didn't make the Dardanelle gun, but it was a gun that shot all the way across the Straits of the Dardanelle, which was used in Napoleonic times. They had for so long, from the 15th century, the Napoleonic times, They no longer had cannonballs big enough, but they just stuffed it full of junk and shot it at British ships that were trying to force their way through the Dardanelles, and it wrecked them. But he ended up blowing himself up because he kept playing with the guns. He made bigger and bigger guns, and then he finally too much
Well,
powder.
that reminds me of the story of this gun designer. Actually, that's a modern story. The Gerald Bull, I think that was his name.
Yeah.
Canadian. He built the G5 for the South Africans, and then he went to the Iraqis to build
Yeah.
a giant gun, and
Yeah. And that guy,
eventually he ran into a bullet or something.
yeah. I think the Mossad killed him or the CIA or something. But yeah, he had an idea to make a giant multi-stage gun that could shoot satellites up into orbit. Like it was a it was a ballistic like a ballistic missile from a gun. I love it. Yeah, that guy was a fascinating character too. Okay, so look, let's circle back to Brescia and
Uh-huh.
IFHIMA and the project and the place and yeah, because that's a very, very interesting for anybody that wants to take HEMA to another level. I was talking this morning, a guy visiting another young instructor, and I was talking to him about the layers that we go through in achieving understanding. And I think the lesson, maybe for me, you tell me what you think, but the more I learn in 20 years and probably let's say 15 years of really trying to understand the period and the sources, I have more and more and more respect for these people. These people, I really, not only were they not dumb compared to people today, I think a lot of them were significantly smarter and in a lot of ways better educated. But anyway,
Mhm.
so if you want to take it to the next level, if you're just getting into HEMA or you're doing it for a while, let's talk about what they're doing in Brescia and what you did
Okay.
there.
So yeah. So what I did there was actually quite simple. So I'm a secretary of the IFIMA, which is the International Federation for Historical European Martial Arts. So we're a group that unites several countries. Uh, Nowadays, we're still just European countries, but we're trying to expand. Um, so we have a lot of projects. One of so we have like sportive projects such as the IFIMA Cup, which we have national teams playing and competing, and also we have, and this is the what I like the most because yeah, I like fencing, but history, like I told you, that's what I love the most. Uh,
Yeah.
and so we have this cultural approach, which is quintessential to HEMA, in my opinion. And so we try to create conferences and meetings and expositions and stuff like that. So we went to Brescia a couple of times. I went there a couple of times, and the last time was the one big event where we had palestra. So that's what talks like we're having here. Um, with very, very brilliant people. For instance, the guy who's running Wittgenauer and Daniel Jacquet and Manuel Val and even myself. Imagine. Uh, so we made those presentations, and what they're doing there in Brescia, particularly, it's they have this museum where they have weapons, okay, historical weapons. You can go there, you can try the weapons, you can see how they balance, how they were how they were actually, not the current what we have nowadays.
Right, not replicas, but real antique weapons from the period.
Which completely different. You can see, for instance, even heavy weapons. You can see how well balanced they are, and also
Yeah,
you
I've
can see
experienced
that.
that.
Yeah, also you can see that you have different types of weapons, different types of balances. They were not just the same. Okay, so they were not standardized. That's very, very interesting. Very, people really should go there. And like I said, Roberto Gotti also has this huge collection of manuscripts and manuals and printed editions and
And real
first
ones,
editions.
right? Real period manual, not copies and so on. It's like actual. I mean,
Yeah,
not
yeah, yeah.
modern copies. Yeah.
Not modern copies, the originals, and that is amazing. that is amazing because you can actually see books. Some of them are almost unknown. Some of them are actually, I mean, the secret sort of because, for instance, they have this small manual, like a book like this big, very small. It's actually like Italian judo from the 17th century. It's
What?
amazing. Yes, yes, they
Wonderful.
already.
Yeah. So you mean judo from Japan?
No, not judo from Japan. It's the same techniques but from
Okay,
Italy.
Italian. Yeah, okay, yeah. So from the Italian
Italian
grappling
judo.
tradition.
And all of that. So what they want, people, investigators, to go there and do their research. Okay, look at books, study those books. Okay, because it's not the same. Not the same looking at some copies. Okay, but looking at the originals. And so they want to become a center for investigation center for people to go there, study things, see the weapons.
And it's a
That's
beautiful
the
place too. I've seen videos and photos. And it's really, it's like a sort of a cathedral to this thing that we're all doing. And you could say it's the Mecca of HEMA. I don't know if that fits, but it's also just, it's like a Renaissance Italian cathedral. It's a beautiful, or like that kind of interior space. It's not obviously that big, but the art and the
statues and all. So
yeah,
it's very.
incredible. I saw a presentation that he did recently that I was on the. This is one of these many things that I've been learning more and more because I was the interview I did last week with Joshua Weist. He was talking about the case of swords, fighting with dual swords, and you were doing the sword and the cloak. The you saw the video that Gotti did. He was showing these paired swords. So you have both swords in the same sheath. You pull them out, and you've got two. Amazing stuff.
I got those in my hands. So
Wow.
not
Yeah, very.
like
I've got sword envy. I got to handle some antiques when I did a presentation at the Higgins Museum in Massachusetts, and then we also used to have. So we handled several there, and which is that. I'll circle back to that. And then there's also we used to have a wonderful. You know how in every horror movie, or not every horror movie, but everyone that has to do with, let's say, vampires or something, the protagonists go to some store where they buy like a copy of the Necronomicon and like a gun that shoots silver bullets, and there's like this amazing array, and they just nonchalant about it, like, oh yeah, you can get all this stuff at the antique store. We had an antique store like that. It was some insane guy, rich guy that had bought all this stuff, and it was just amazing. And they had like a Scottish basket hilt sword that supposedly had been made for the King of France. There, they had lots and lots of real weapons that were from all over the world, the Ottoman stuff and African and from Thailand and Japanese and everything. But they had this 17th century sword that was in the Scottish basket hilt style, and they wanted $10,000 for it. And it was out of my reach, but they would let you handle them, and you put that in your hand, and it, like you were saying about the balance, it didn't feel like it was heavy or light. It just felt like I had a 7-foot arm that was sharp. The balance was just unreal. And everybody I would bring people there and show it to them. Feel this. This is what the real thing is like. And that's 17th century where it's not as good as the 15th century stuff, to me.
in Gothi's museum. I had exactly. You can go there. You can pick the weapons just like that. I mean, just like I'm picking this
Yeah.
thing. Okay, the real thing. Okay, and yeah, that was this rapier because I'm a rapierist. This rapier it was quite heavy in itself, but when you pick it in your hand, it was like so well balanced. You were just like, whoa, this is fantastic. This is fantastic. I could rapier with this.
It wants to get in there and stab somebody.
Yeah. No, of course not.
That would be illegal to stab someone. I would never.
Don't do that things.
It wants
Those
world
things.
peace.
Yeah, and hefted weapons also. He has hefted weapons as well, and I think the only thing he didn't had was Montantes. those those big swords from Godinho and so on. I think that was the only thing he didn't have. As for the rest, daggers and everything,
It's
small
an
swords,
ongoing
everything.
project that keeps building up, and so it's very 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 worthy project,
He's
and one
always,
that I
he's working and is always searching for new items, new books, for instance. He's an avid collector. That's good. That's good.
it makes sense to me, and I certainly had this feeling. At the Higgins, they also had a copy of the one of the Joachim Meyer copies. So it's, I think from the 16th century, and it was quite small. Those illustrations in Joachim Meyer are so finely cut
Right.
that I've seen them blown up 8 feet wide on a wall, and it looks good, but the actual original is only this big. And I think seeing those books and seeing but it was not a big book, probably smaller than this one,
No, no, no,
uh,
no. Way smaller. Way smaller. Yeah.
but the I think seeing the real antique weapons and seeing the real books, is like a reminder that this is real, because we live in a time when everything is fake and everything is in the digital world, and it doesn't seem real. And a lot of the young people in the fencing world, I think, especially in the U.S., but also obviously in Europe too, there's a lot of these silly arguments they get into where they're people that don't know the history in general, but they study sometimes some of them are studying the fight book itself, like it's the Talmud, like going through every single letter and every single line and comparing them, and they're arguing about things like, is this fencing for real survival, or is it just a game? And still arguing about things that we kind of have figured out 20 years ago. But it's partly because I think for a lot of people, and focusing too much on your personal glory and focusing too much on tournaments and all that and the rules, and did the judge call it right, and should we go to the electronic, God forbid. But I think that tends to eliminate the fact that we're forgetting that we're doing sword fighting, not because we want to be famous on Instagram. We're doing sword fighting because we were drawn to some sort of primal connection that we have to the past and to our ancestors and to these cultures that are so sophisticated, that from which art and architecture is still generating billions of dollars in tourist revenue every year, because people are moved by being in the presence of it. And I think I think you would feel the same way, but you tell me what you think. For me, when I feel a connection, if I have a student that I've managed to teach just a basic thing to, and I see them pull it off in a fencing match, and they look for a moment like a picture from one of the manuals, I feel like I have that connection. That is, to me, it's a sacred thing. This is a culture that we haven't always treated as if it was as important as it is, and I think it is very important. And in the fencing, the fact that we can read books of sword fighting written 400, 500, 600 years ago that are really sophisticated martial arts, that's amazing and incredible. And it's a direct pipeline into that world.
Some time ago, this guy Niccolo Menozzi, which is the guy who's doing the Spadone project, he called me and some other guys the wizards. Okay, why are we wizards? Because we read the sources, the original sources, the original language, and so on. For me, like, again, for history, I'm most of all an history buff. Everything I do, for instance, modeling, model making and wargaming.
Yeah, I got all that stuff too.
No one noticed. And sword fighting. For me, it's a connection with history. Okay, my ancestors' history and European history and so on. And reading the sources, searching, understanding what was back then, how was back then, what did they thought, what did they experience, and so on, and bring it back to our days. Okay, that's a fantastic experience. So yes, when I watching my colleagues, my friends fighting, or when I watch myself fighting with sword and rodel, that big round shield and so on, I sense a connection between me and what my ancestors were doing like 500 years ago. Okay,
Yeah.
I can see myself, okay, in the galley fighting the Turks, for instance,
Right.
or
Right.
doing that stuff. And it's very important because, for instance, if I go to Belém or to Lisbon proper, okay, where I see all those things about our history, um, I see that what I'm doing right now, it makes sense. Okay, it has this connection. I'm reviving it. I'm bringing it back to so that other people. That's why these kind of interviews that you're doing are also so important. Or the book that you wrote, the two books actually that you wrote are so important because
Thank you.
that's thank you, because that's a way we can tell people, hey, this was that was it. Okay, that's what was happening. This is our history. This is us, actually.
And these are the things we can learn from it. And I also want to just make one comment that, because I think people sometimes they hear us talking about, our ancestors fighting the Turks and things like that. And sometimes they think it's like nationalistic. But one of the things that I've learned about, not that that's always bad, but to be proud of your nation or anything. But one of the things that I've also learned about this period that makes it so interesting to me, because it also ties in a little bit with where I'm from. Here in New Orleans, we have something called Creole, which I think comes from a Portuguese word, and it means the people in the new land, but what it means here is the overlapping connections between all of us exiles that have been thrown out of the old country. Y'all just cruelly threw us over here in the swamps and the mountains, and we take what was brought from the old country, because when you get thrown away, went to a wild land like the Americas, you lose a lot. But what we pick up from each other, and so we have this combination of, French and Spanish and African, and then later on, Irish and Italian and Vietnamese and Croatian and everything, and it comes together and it makes something pretty interesting. That's how we get jazz and the food that we have here and things. And I look at the Renaissance and the medieval world, I see that merchants are traveling all over Europe, like we were talking earlier about the Danzig merchants in Lisbon, but also these guys are in Turkey and in the Levant and in North Africa. The Venetians got all the way to Timbuktu in Mali, and nobody else from Europe got there until the 19th century. And the Venetians got to China in the 13th century, and this Hema revival that we're in, it just like you were coming from Korean martial arts to Renaissance martial arts from Europe. We also have a Hema revival going on in China and in Korea and in Japan and in all these other places. Singapore. I met some fencers from Singapore at Dijon. Had a fascinating conversation with them.
Malaysia
Yeah,
also.
and in Turkey, Turkey's one of the places where they found one of the training swords that we use. So that's really cool too. We're bringing all this stuff, and those people that were so smart in the Renaissance, they were studying Arab and Persian scholars of the Romans and Greeks to get up to speed, and then adding everything that they could figure out. Like Fibonacci, the great Italian mathematician, he knew that the numbers that he brought back to Europe to save everybody from having to do their taxes in Roman numerals. Can you imagine using Latin math to do your taxes or something? Like he says, no, we're going to use numbers from this number system from India is better, and we're going to add that to our thing, and that's how we're going to level up. And they did. And so I think it's a very open and welcoming thing. Once you're through the threshold and into the history of this Hema world, it's a really nice community. It reminds me a little bit of the old punk scene in a way that way.
The more you know about history, you can understand that everybody had influences from someone else. For instance, our military history. Okay, we have a lot of ranks like Adail, which was the captain of the horses, or Alferes. Okay, Alferes is the standard bearer. Okay, those are Arabic
Yeah,
terms. Jinete, the Spanish jinete, which means a rider, okay, horse
yeah.
rider. Okay,
A lot of
that's
times it means
also
the light cavalry, right?
light cavalry. That's from Morocco. Okay, so and so on and so forth. For instance, here in Portugal, we had Genoese. Our first admiral of the sea was actually a Genoese. He came
Just
with
like
some
Christopher
other.
Columbus, he was a Genoese too, for the Spanish.
Exactly. We had scholars during the discoveries. We had scholars, Jewish and Moorish, Jewish and Moorish scholars working alongside Christians, to develop stuff, mathematicians, astronomers, and so on. Okay.
Yeah, gunpowder seems to have come to Europe through the Arabs into Portugal and Spain, and then Roger Bacon, who was a Franciscan friar in England, it was corresponding with Jewish and Muslim scholars in Iberia,
Uh-huh.
and that's how the
Uh-huh.
gunpowder formula got to the Latin world. That's a pretty
Yeah.
interesting.
And for instance, you know that in Turkish, and I think it's in Persian as well, orange, it's called portakal.
Yeah,
The
I
Portuguese.
saw a thing where there was one of the words they used for the craft guilds in Barcelona was they called them like the Germans. That's what they called their guild organization, their craft organizations. I thought that was pretty interesting.
We had a lot of Germans here in Lisbon. Lots of them. Lots
Yeah.
of them.
So next time we have a discussion, I'd like to we should talk about the Portuguese explorations down through the Red Sea and into Ethiopia and through the Indian Ocean and into the Pacific Rim and all that, because I think that is a wonderfully interesting story of lots of
Yeah.
cultural crossing and merging. And the Portuguese were quite good about that. I remember reading very amusing. I'll maybe kind of wrap up with this one. There's this samurai the Shoguns series is out right now, and so people are interested in that story. And if you read there's a very good book about the original guy, the real guy, William Adams, the English navigator who became a samurai, had kind of a pet of this Japanese warlord. And they go through a bunch of the things that had happened in the era, and one of the things was that the city of Nagasaki was created basically by the Portuguese as a trading entrepot for the Japanese, because the Japanese had gotten themselves thrown out of all the Chinese and Indonesian ports and everything, because they would tend to, when they're negotiating with somebody and made them mad, they're trying to cut their head off. So the Portuguese were the middlemen, and then the Spanish were gaining power, and I think this might have been the period when the Spanish had briefly conquered Portugal. So the Spanish showed up, and they wanted to go trade silk, because it was the Portuguese were providing all the silk for Japan, who wanted a lot of silk, but they couldn't go to China to get it. So the Portuguese were making some dineros, man. So like the Portuguese told the Spanish, said, "Look, you bring the now ship." The caravel, don't bring a big old galleon full of silk, because that's too much money, and then so that's going to be too tempting to the warlords. And the Spanish said, okay, get out of my room, So then they bring a huge galleon in there against the advice of the Portuguese, and then sure enough, a bunch of Japanese daimyo attack it, and they get in this crazy fight, and the Spanish were really killer fighters, but they're right there, and the wind wasn't for them, so they were just inching out of the harbor, and this massive battle was going on, and they realized they were losing the ship. So being hardcore like they were, they torched the magazine and blew it up. And
Are you pretty sure? Because that looks pretty much like an incident in 1610, I think, with a Portuguese ship. Because there was there was this quarrel in Macau, which was run by the Portuguese, with the Portuguese versus some Japanese merchantmen. And so when our ship went to Nagasaki, they actually stormed the ship. The Japanese stormed the ship for 3 or 4 days or something, or a week or something like that.
okay, that might have been the
And
same incident then. Yeah, maybe.
Nossa, Nossa Senhora, Our Lady of something, and that was the name of the ship. And so eventually they didn't manage to actually storm the ship. So one day they mounted a huge storming party, and they went against the ship. And when the captain saw, well, okay, everything is lost, so fuck it. He
Yeah.
torched the ship. It blew up, killed a lot of people, and that's it.
Well, yeah, you might be right. That might be the thing. But let's next time we talk, let's go down the trade route. You know, all the way around the Horn of Africa and across the Indian Ocean and the early days, because we can talk about the sources, because there's a lot of great sources. There's a Venetian guy who has I've read some of his account, which is really neat. And then I don't remember the name of it, but there's that one Portuguese source that has we could show these. It has pictures of all the people in all the places all the way down the journey. You know, like in India and Ethiopia and China and everywhere. Anyway, I know it's getting late where you are, so we should. Well, look, it's been a great pleasure, my friend, and it always is.
Yeah, you usually have some very nice talks.
Yeah, I've already learned a lot from you, and I hope we get to do this in the future again. Any final thoughts?
Okay, sure. All of you, keep practicing. Read the sources again, and practice a lot. That's it.
I'm going to say also on top of that, read the context around the sources, because it'll make the sources make a lot more sense to you. All right, man. Let's wrap this one up, and good night, my friend. How do you say good night in Portuguese?
Boa noite.
Boa noite. Boa noite.
Good evening. Good night to you
Okay.
too.
Ciao.